Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here tonight at the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Public Affairs here at CIGI, and I'm honored to be your co-host for this evening. I say co-host because the event is sponsored jointly by CIGI and the CIC. CIC is the Canadian International Council, a non-partisan nationwide council established to strengthen Canada's foreign policy. It promotes dialogue on international affairs issues through a national network with 15 branches from coast to coast. And the CIC's Waterloo chapter president, Joan Eiler, is here with us tonight. CIGI, meanwhile, is a non-partisan independent think tank that addresses international governance challenges. It's also a partner in the schools that you see coming together on the Pasili campus next door. You no doubt have seen the construction. This campus will become home to a group of schools, including the already fully operational Balsley School of International Affairs, the other partners in that being the local universities. CIGI's evening public lectures are presented monthly on important international topics to raise public awareness and understanding of current global issues. Our speaker series features some of the most prominent and acclaimed researchers and figures in the international relations field. Tonight's event marks the final signature lecture for CIGI's 2009-10 season. Thank you, our audience, for your support of our public programming throughout the year. We'll be back in the fall with a stellar lineup of prominent speakers on topical and engaging topics, including preservation of human rights during war, security sector reform issues, piracy and terrorism, and other topics. Just a note that our last noon lecture is this Monday, June 28th, with Justina Dillon from Harvard, and her lecture is entitled Rule of Law and Justice Development in Post-Conflict, a review of Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. And I can promise you that you'll find her conclusions surprising. We'd like to extend our sincere thank you to our events media sponsor 570 News, and Joe Pavia and his news team are with us in our audience tonight. Their year-round support on air for our events brings awareness for CIGI and always new faces out to our events. I'd also like to thank our bookstore partner that you've seen throughout the year, Wordsworth Books of Uptown Waterloo. Tonight's event is the third annual Foreign Correspondence Panel at CIGI, and our theme this year is Danger, Disaster, and Deadlines. It's a 3D event. We're all grateful for the work that foreign correspondents perform on our behalf, bringing us news from all around the planet and often at great risk to themselves. Tragically, and all too often, lives are lost in this work. We reflect on the death of Michelle Lang, a Calgary Herald reporter killed this past December, along with 4 Canadian soldiers when their armored vehicle struck a bomb on the outskirts of Kandahar city. Worldwide, in fact, about 80 journalists are killed doing their job every year, and many others are imprisoned, arrested, or otherwise threatened and harassed. All of this in the name of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and the need for people like you and me to be informed about events going on in the world about us. Experienced in these matters are all the members of tonight's panel, all highly accomplished foreign correspondents. They'll be introduced presently by the moderator. But first, it's my privilege to introduce that very moderator. Paul Wells is a notorious, oh sorry, that's my private notes. Paul Wells is a senior columnist for Maclean's magazine and is himself an experienced foreign correspondent, including from uncomfortable places such as Afghanistan and comfortable places such as Paris. He's also written for Time magazine, the National Post, Literary Review of Canada, and his first book was a bestseller titled Right Side Up, The Fall of Paul Martin and the Rise of Stephen Harper's New Conservatism. His work has been praised by the likes of Mordecai Richler, who said he had, quote, the highest regard for Paul Wells as a writer, and also Paul's columns in Maclean's were recently described as, quote, the single best reason to read the magazine, unquote, and that was said by me, Fred Kuntz. And it's a sentiment shared, no doubt, by many here, so now I turn it over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank all of you for coming out to this panel, which is something I've been looking forward to since I was invited to moderate it. I have the easy job. I just point to these guys and then they're going to tell you what their work is like. The title of the panel is Danger, Disaster, and Deadlines, Canadians Reporting from Abroad. I heard Patrick Martin volunteer to be Danger. Unusually, I'm in charge of deadlines tonight. I'll be the one playing traffic cop, and so there'll be a fierce three-way fight for disaster. Let me set the stage. We're here to discuss one of the most glamorous but least subscribed parts of our profession. Actually, very few Canadian journalists aspire to foreign work. It's much more common for people to prefer to stay at home and cover the communities that they know and stay with the people that they like. And then there are those rare eccentrics who abandon all of that for a short stint or a longer period and go out into the world to tell that fraction of the Canadian audience that wants to hear about the world what it's like. Very often they go to the most dangerous places. Every once in a while they pay serious prices for the risk that they undertake. But almost none of us, I think we'll get a chance to discuss this, almost none of us are hot dogs or danger freaks. We want to go where the stakes are high, and we want to get to a vantage point where we can tell that story. And every once in a while, it involves having days that are not very much like the days that we would have if we had stayed at home. An annoying bit of autobiography. I spent a year as a European correspondent for Maclean's. I traveled to Warsaw, Berlin, London, Tbilisi, Georgia. I did the first of 3 very brief stints in Afghanistan there. I've covered presidential elections in the United States and municipal elections in France. That makes me by far the least experienced foreign correspondent that you have up here tonight. So I will take that as my cue to say not much after these introductory remarks. Let me tell you about the rest of these folks who are perhaps less familiar because they haven't been as home as much as I have. Immediately to my right is Patrick Martin. He's a veteran Middle East correspondent for the Globe and Mail. He first started reporting from that region in 1971 when he was not yet born, right? No, only when Patrick was only 20. And he motorcycled across North Africa. And from there, first sporadically and then more formally, he started sending pieces to the Globe as a freelancer. And then from 1991 to 95, he was their first Middle East-based staff correspondent. Came home to be foreign editor in the mid-90s, common editor from 99 to 2008. He has been back to Iraq and other points. You were in the Middle East quite recently, weren't you? Like,
yeah, well, I'm living there now.
Yeah, I saw a byline from there like days ago.
48 hours ago.
Are you sure you're here tonight? So Patrick has been at this for longer than I've been at almost anything. Nahlah Ayed, a dear old friend of mine who used to be in Ottawa for the Canadian Press, and then shortly after Chrétien won his 3rd majority, decided she'd had enough of that and went to first Afghanistan and then to the Middle Eastern region more broadly, where you've seen her almost every night on The National, of course, as the CBC's Middle East correspondent. She has come home lately to Montreal in the last year, where she nominally maintains a post here in Canada for The National. But of course, almost any night. Where have you been in the last, say, 6 months, Nahlah?
You let me answer?
Yeah.
Haiti, Germany, London, Washington, Santo Domingo, Israel, Amman.
Okay.
That's all I can remember.
Your phone bill must be appalling. So that's Nahlah Ayed, everyone. To her right is Martin Reg-Khan, who writes a weekly column on foreign affairs for the Toronto Star, where he's also the deputy editorial page editor. Before that, he was the foreign editor, deputy city editor, and a foreign correspondent for 11 years in the Star's Middle East and Asia bureaus. A running theme in the deployment of the correspondents that you have up here. Every one of them has served in the Middle East. He has reported for more than 40 countries. He's been nominated 4 times for the National Newspaper Award in international reporting. But then he's from the Star, and I believe it's contractual. Everyone at the Star is nominated for a National Newspaper Award every year. He's recipient of the Amnesty International Canadian Media Award for his reporting from Sudan, blah, blah, blah. He's really done everything and been everywhere, Martin Reg-Khan. And then I I'm agnostic about whether this is going to work. We're going to start off by talking to someone who's not even here tonight because he's doing his job, Bill Graveland, who's an Afghanistan correspondent with the Canadian Press. Bill, are you with us? Up. Hi, Bill. He may, his mouth may start moving when I finish introducing him. We'll see. Oh, really? Okay, the link is coming soon. This is his 5th time in Afghanistan. I was just in Afghanistan for a week in April, and almost everyone's that I dealt with began their anecdotes with, well, the way Bill Graveland does it is. Before that, he was in another mountainous, well, no, he wasn't. He was the Prairie Bureau Chief and Western Canadian Manager for Standard Broadcast News. He's the recipient of a bunch of Radio and Television News Directors Association awards for his documentaries on the war in Afghanistan. There are perhaps 1 or 2 Canadian reporters who have spent as much time in Afghanistan as him, but not more than that. And we're very grateful that he's able, at least in theory, to join us tonight. I don't know if the technical people can tell us whether he's ready to go. Okay. Hi, the technical people. Hi, guys. Okay. Bill's based at the Kandahar airfield, which is, as the name implies, an airfield in Kandahar. It is the base for almost all of the Canadian troops when they're not at forward operating bases, and in fact for 20,000 troops from all different countries. There's a lovely little French croissanterie. There is a famous Tim Hortons on the boardwalk. You can play volleyball if you don't mind the high fecal content in the dirt that you'll kick up when you play. And until only a few weeks ago, there was a Burger King and a Subway. But General McChrystal, the American commander of the forces in Afghanistan, decided that too many American soldiers were losing a little bit of their edge at the Burger King, so he had those restaurants shut down. Shortly before noon today in Washington, President Obama had General McChrystal shut down, but that's another story. I sense a disturbance in the force. Is there anything going on?
Depends what you consider by going on.
Oh, there we go. Could that be you, Bill?
Modern technology has prevailed.
I didn't even hear that. Oh, modern technology.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Bill Graveland from CP.
Yeah.
How are you? Paul Wells here in Waterloo.
I am fine, thank you. Paul?
We're going to have you for about 10 minutes, Bill, and then we're going to let you go. What time is it over there in Kandahar?
It's about 3:30 a.m. right now.
Okay. So you're just getting home from the bar. No, it's just...
You're right. And a little brothel, of course.
It is, yeah. I believe they have orange juice at the bar at the Kandahar airfield. Bill, I'm going to start with a pretty broad question, but it's the question you must face every time you call home to your loved ones. What are you doing over there? Have you not heard that it's dangerous? Why did you want to leave the Western Bureau of Standard Broadcast News and plant your ass in Kandahar? What good does it do anyone?
Well, it's actually Canadian Press. It used to be Standard Broadcast News that I was part of. Coming to a war zone has been something that I've had as a dream from the time I was in college. And I actually had a professor that was a long-time radio news director, and he was playing us these reports from Edward R. Murrow, the famous newsman, which would be broadcasts from London during the Second World War. And then 5,000 years later, you finally get an opportunity to go to a war zone, because, well, Canada hasn't been in many of these. And so when I was first asked 4 years ago if I wanted to go, I jumped at it. And once you get over here, and you've been here as well, it's kind of gets in your blood. And things seem to actually mean something when you're writing from over here and watching history unfold.
Okay. Yeah, Patrick's theory is that Bill's speaking Pashtun. My own hunch. Professor Stephen Hawking is across the street at the Perimeter Institute, and I believe we're actually running Bill's feed through Professor Hawking's voice synthesizer. So I hope you can, I hope together we'll unlock the secrets of the universe tonight. As you know, Bill, I sometimes swoop through Kandahar and pick up a bunch of briefings and then leave before the trouble starts. And so that leaves me, as it does a lot of the audience here, with an unclear picture of your working circumstances there. Could you tell us how many Canadian reporters there are at CAF right now? How often and under what circumstances you're able to get outside the wire? And what kind of stories you've been working on over the last couple of months, most recently at this stage of the conflict?
It used to be, even a couple of years ago, there were a lot more media here, at least Canadian media. At the moment, from a Canadian standpoint, you've got the Canadian Press, CanWest News Service, a TV pool representing Global and CBC Television. Occasionally the Globe and Mail. They haven't been here as often as they were. Toronto Star has someone, and there's been a long list of American media outlets who have suddenly taken quite an interest in coming here, especially with the big surge that you're seeing this summer. Which we still have not seen. The situation is that it's a fairly simple procedure to get outside out to the forward operating bases, out with the troops. The transport is probably the only thing that slows it down, and they have to have space. It's become a much busier place here since we've had like an extra 30,000 U.S. troops come to Kandahar Airfield, and to all of the small outposts all the way around. The kind of stories, after we've been here as long as we have, you start wondering, you start worrying that you're going to start repeating stories. Generally, you try to look at the stories we've been working on is the success of the Canadian helicopters that have been here. There's, of course, always the sad part of the job, covering anytime there's a death. Plenty of stories trying to explain to people about improvised explosive devices, successes that they've been having with the developing of things like the Ball Dam and a lot of the schools, and of course the training of the Afghan security people. It's an interesting place to be, because once you're here, it's like you're in a different world altogether. People try to stay connected back to Canada, but the thing is that generally it's Premier Afghan used to talk about dome disease, where he said that people needed to, they were inside the dome of the Alberta legislature, and they didn't see what was going on outside their own area. That's kind of what we're going through here. It's kind of heartening to see the work that's being done and some of the successes. When you're here enough times, you start worrying that perhaps the successes aren't as great as you would hope they would be. They've built schools, and they've brought wells to the villages, and and they're helping them with growing Canadian wheat. But things haven't really changed all that much, and it's almost as if we have a before date, and it's starting to run out, because a lot of the Afghan people seem frustrated that things haven't improved more dramatically.
Okay. I'm not revealing any secrets when I say that the Skype feed from Kandahar is a little bit dodgy. We're sorry that the audio is not perfect, but we're getting the gist of what Bill is able to tell us. Obviously, Bill, as a journalist, you're not a free agent out there. You don't get to cover whatever you want. The two biggest influences, I think, on you, as on anyone in a war zone, are the military with whom you have to operate, and the Canadian government for whom they work, on the one hand, and your assignment desk back home. How pleased are you to work with both of those agents, and how do they weigh on your news gathering decisions?
I have to give Canadian press a lot of credit, and that's not just because my bosses may be listening. When we come over here, you're almost completely autonomous. Generally, you have the decision that what you think is the story of the day. And we all have to cover the breaking news stories that everybody sees on the news, but we also have a lot of latitude in what we want to cover. Everybody has a fixer. Well, most of the media outlets have a fixer, which is an Afghan individual who acts as an interpreter and a driver, and pretty much can arrange interviews for you. We have the ability, and a lot of us do it on a fairly regular basis, in order to go into places like Kandahar City. You put on the local garb and basically keep your head down so that nobody can see you. But the thing is that you do have the option of being able to go out and talk to the people of Afghanistan and work on stories. Last year, I spent a day out with the United Nations demining crew that had nothing to do with the Canadian military. The Canadian military, as long as you let them know that you're going outside, if you have a fixer, they're fine with it. They're just more wanting to know that you have gone out just in case something happens, and they think they may have to take efforts to rescue you. Everybody who comes over to Afghanistan signs an MDET agreement, and you agree to follow the various rules that they have set out. And there are plenty of rules. But I have never had the Canadian military tell me that I cannot send a story without them reading it first. There have been times that they haven't liked what we have written, or they may have a complaint about it, but that is only after it's finally gone out on the internet. They're sort of like a benign public relations crew that you find at a major company, in that they would like you to write stories a certain way, but they don't have any real desire to push you to write it that way. I'm speaking as loudly and slowly as I can. I'm hoping this is at least coming true for you.
Okay. That matches my experience over there too, is that what you get is not sort of sharp disapproval, but a kind of a mother guilt trip disappointment in you. Why did you have to write it that way? Is the way they usually do it. One last question.
It's true. Yeah, that's exactly how.
It is, and it's not ineffective either, because they seem so sad.
Guilt really does wonders. That's my mother.
I guess the last question, Bill, before we let you go and try and catch a little bit of sleep before the pub reopens, and that is, what sense of relationship do you have to your audience? I know at Maclean's we've noticed lately in the last few years that when we write about Afghanistan, our audience declines noticeably. We can actually trace it on our website. The page hits go down and things like that. Are you sure the audience is still with you? And does that, if you're less sure that it is than it used to be, does that affect your own sense of the importance of the assignment?
I actually don't think so. There was actually a couple of years ago, there was a Toronto Star reporter who was here for a little while, and he at the time had expressed that it was no longer relevant and that people didn't want to read about it anymore. And I tend to disagree with that, but I agree to it to a point. I've spoken to some university students and asked me about the fact that why don't you report more on the positive news good news that is happening. To which I replied at the time that it's all very well and good to write a story about Canadian soldiers building a new well in the village of wherever. However, once you write about the fact that Canadian soldiers have built a new well, people probably aren't going to read the story again because they've read it once. So I believe there's still an audience out there, but the key is finding stories that are actually going to get their attention. And it can be the most frivolous thing. Last year, I was at the PRT in Kandahar City, and I was sort of chit-chatting with one of the warrant officers from the Canadian Forces, who was noting that in the expansion, they were not allowed to use this giant warehouse for a maintenance bay. And I said, why? And he said, well, it's because of all that art that's drawn on the walls, and they want to turn it into some kind of a shrine. And then he explained to me that during the Taliban regime, there were 1,500 prisoners kept in there for years. So we went in, and the walls are covered with these amazing charcoal drawings of everyday Afghan life and birds. And so I did a story on that, and everybody was excited about it. The Kandahar Museum has a number of treasures in it now that were hidden away from the Taliban when they took over. And once the Karzai government was put in place, people started bringing back these treasures to put them into the museum in Kandahar. It doesn't always have to be, building a well or reporting on things that are very unhappy, or there are some things that people are going to read about, and they're going to sigh when they hear a Canadian soldier was killed by an IED. And the ramp ceremonies are all very emotional. Today we had a group of family members of 9 different soldiers who died over the last 2 years. And to them, the fact that the mission now seems to make sense to them, I think that's something that people can relate to, and I think that the audience can connect to. But you have to be able to make people attached to a story on some level, whether it be emotionally or just that's an interesting story. So from that point of view, I think that in some ways the audience probably has declined, but only because perhaps they've seen the stories so many times before that they just don't feel an urge to read it.
Okay. Bill Graveland, we're gonna leave you there for now. We do appreciate you staying up late and taking the time to talk to us. Stay alert, stay safe for the rest of your time there, and we hope to see you home real soon. Thanks very much, okay?
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Patrick Martin, I'm going to start with a variation of the same question that I asked Bill right off the top. Although with you, it's an unusual case. The question is, why did you become a foreign correspondent? But to some extent, you were a foreign correspondent before you were a correspondent of any other kind. It was the foreign that came before the correspondent. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I had been fortunate enough to have a position at CBC Radio, where I was the co-host of a show called Sunday Morning, where we went and did an awful lot of interesting things around the world. But my job as host was more or less to stay closer to home and go to Washington and Ottawa. But at the earliest opportunity I could, Bronwyn and I, who were the co-hosts of the show together, we took off, moved to Greece, and at that point I decided to try to relaunch a career more as a foreign correspondent, because it was the part of my work that I'd always found most intriguing. While we were living in Greece for the year, I ventured into the Middle East on a more formal basis. I had motorcycled across North Africa some years before, but I wasn't doing many interviews at that time. I was just trying to make it from one town to the next. On this occasion, though, I had a chance to visit Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, and I became entranced by the subject matter. Both the nature of the conflict and the nature of the people were just intrinsically appealing to me. So I was very selfish in my approach to journalism. I really wanted at that point to be a correspondent. And fortunately, when I returned to Canada, I did write a book on Canadian politics, and the Globe and Mail hired me. And I think they hoped that I'd go to Ottawa for them. In fact, my interest, I told them, was really as a foreign correspondent, and I wanted to go to the Middle East where they didn't have a bureau. It took several years before I could finally convince them. I joined them in '84, and finally in '91 they opened and said, okay, you can go. And that was the first of my venture. It was my formal venture for the Globe. The Globe Mail, as I think most of you know, is really renowned for its foreign bureaus. And it was a tremendous oversight, in my view, that they didn't have a bureau in the Middle East. So I was trying to position myself to be that guy who would fill that gap. And it's been very satisfying for me to do that.
Okay. Briefly, because we'll be looping around to this in various ways, how has the generic job of reporting home from abroad changed since you started doing it?
Well, in the very beginning, there wasn't anything like the internet, of course. There was a very primitive system of filing reports, even in the early 90s. Right up until 95, we were using a very primitive system. Later, as you can imagine now, with Skype, with electronic communications being what they are, thanks to the good people at RIM and others, we have an ability to transmit our stories instantaneously on a level that we could never do before. We can operate, I think my colleague here from CBC would tell you, on a shoestring budget compared to what it used to be because of new technology. Because of new technology, we also are expected to file for our websites on a more frequent basis, which is more demanding. It does provide a certain immediacy, but it is very demanding for us all, because if we spend all our time on the web, when are we going to do those thought-provoking pieces that we would really like to achieve? So yeah, I think it has hurried everything up in these 20 years, and it's the single biggest change, the communications gap that has been filled by new technology.
Okay. Nahlah, you've since diversified your portfolio, like in the last year, you've been, I think, everywhere. But I'll stay on the Middle Eastern thing. I apologize profusely if I have my math wrong, but you were an undergrad at the University of Manitoba, if you were even there yet, when Patrick opened the Globe Middle Eastern Bureau.
Thanks.
And do you ever start thinking the story hasn't progressed an inch since then?
I think that all the time, actually. Yeah. I think most people who follow the Middle East probably have fantasized about just changing the date and picking out the names and plugging in somebody else's. It'd be exactly the same story. But I grew up in a household that was, because of my background, I was very interested in the Middle East, but also just interested in world affairs in general. My parents really valued reading the world section, and not a lot of parents in our neighborhood did, and they pushed us to do it. And so that's really where it started.
Okay. Yeah. You've been home for a year. Were you missing Canada? Was any part of you missing the more mundane work that the rest of us do back here? Feel free to say no.
The short answer is no. No, of course. I mean, what's difficult about foreign correspondence, but specifically TV and foreign correspondence, is the logistics. I mean, it's almost never actually about the story. The story is out there, and as you said, there's so much repetition that you kind of memorize the names and faces. If you've got any memory at all, you could do it within a couple of weeks. So what's difficult are the logistics. And so what I missed was not so much, the story was always compelling, and in fact, if you sent me there right now, actually I was there just a couple of days ago, but if you sent me there right now, I'd go again. But what I really missed was just a straightforward day. Where you could get up, go gather what you need, and actually do real journalism, sit down and work on writing something that looks good and sounds good, and not just rush through the process because you've got to get from A to B, and that alone is challenging. It's logistics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Martin Kahn, why did you get into this racket?
Well, I grew up in, can you hear me? I grew up in Montreal. And I suppose being an Anglo in Montreal, minority within a majority, it gave me a sense on the one hand of being an outsider, and the other hand of wanting to get in on the inside. And so that got me into journalism. As for why foreign reporting and those foreign cultures, I think the reality is, as I think Nahlah has just implied, foreign reporting, foreign correspondent is the best job in journalism. Journalism, as we often say, beats work. Ergo, best job and worth 11 years of my life. We were talking on the way down in the car, Nahlah and I, about that sense of decompression when you come back to the real world, which I think was your question. to her at least. And it is an adjustment coming back, and especially in my case after more than a decade. I finally, one of the problems or challenges that I faced hit me when I was in Washington and attending a seminar when I was foreign editor. All the other editors from these American papers, maybe their first time in DC, they wanted to go on their first night off to the Vietnam War Memorial. And that's when I had this epiphany that being a foreign correspondent is a returning foreign correspondent is like being a returning Vietnam War veteran. Nobody wants to hear your stories. So for that reason, I'm very grateful to all of you tonight for coming to let us have this cathartic experience of trying to work out our foreign reporting, or in Patrick's case, he had to go back. But for all of us, there is that adjustment. I think that you've seen a lot and you have told a lot while you were there, and you want to keep on telling that story. And people often, at least in Toronto, want to talk about their renovations and their mortgages. I'm sure that doesn't happen in Kitchener, but or Waterloo.
Okay. I was going to advance the thesis that working at the Toronto Star in the Middle East, you are in a no-win situation. But I couldn't put the proposition with a straight face. I myself have never worked at a news organization where someone writing about the Middle East wasn't in a no-win situation. It's simply,
right.
It's axiomatic that people will, about half your audience will say you're too soft on Israel, and half the audience will say you're out to get Israel. How do you navigate that day to day?
Well, Patrick, I'm sure has a similar answer, but it becomes almost a reflexive, not point of pride, but a reflexive defense when you're being attacked from one side. You'll say, well, the other side hits me just as hard or harder. I think it's changed now in that you have, on the one hand, 1/3, if you write a particular story on the Middle East, one constituency is for or against you, depending on your position. Another constituency isn't reading you at all. And a fourth constituency, I would say, is made up of know-it-alls. And I say that not in a trying to be elitist or myself a know-it-all, but having invested 4 years of my life living and traveling around the Middle East, from one end to the other, and then coming back to Canada and seeing sometimes this 100 years war, this massive conflict, reduced to a slogan or an opinion or a blog. Not that I'm against blogs, especially yours, but that sometimes they get these.
I'm often against mine.
You have this sense of this lack of context that can bother me sometimes. But yes, we're always getting hammered, especially in the Middle East. And I'll just briefly say that to a question that a lot of you I think may have, which is, does that affect how we approach the story? And as candidly as I can, I would say it does a little bit. It does, because you're always being hammered for spelling mistakes, for getting the year off, although hopefully not as bad as the New Democrat critic. You were out of the country, but Libby.
1948, yeah.
Yes,
Libby Davies,
Libby
yeah.
Davies, thank you. Not usually off by half a century or a couple of 3 or 4 decades, but so that does, I would say, force you to be accurate and ask yourself, well, can I defend this? And so is there sometimes a second thought? Yes, but I would hope, in all honesty, in all candor, that it doesn't in any way cause us to pull our punches. But it's certainly something you hear.
Patrick?
I was going to say that there are enormous dangers when you operate in zones of conflict, but beyond the dodging of bullets and bombs and security provisions and working with the military, one of the biggest challenges to really doing journalism in an area such as the Middle East, and particularly in a time of tension and conflict, is the other war that's being fought, and that's the propaganda war. I was in Gaza last week. I was there until Thursday afternoon. And it was on Thursday that the Israeli government announced an easing of the blockade of Gaza. Now, you all know about the flotilla and all the international forces that have been at work to pressure Israel to make some changes. So on Thursday, it made some announcements. I was leaving Gaza, and I was with some Palestinians, and as we were leaving, and I saw on my BlackBerry a little note of the nature of the changes, and I read them out to people there, and they all laughed. They really were insubstantial. I got back to Jerusalem, and I was expecting to write something else, but the desk called and said, we gather there's been easing of the blockade in Gaza. We need you to write about it. And I said, well, actually, no, it's not a lot. It doesn't matter. Write whatever. All right. So I wrote the story, And I wrote a lead that said, people in Gaza could be forgiven for thinking that the Israeli easing of the blockade was a cruel joke. And I went on to detail some of the conditions in Gaza, both positive and negative. I'm not one who believes there are people starving in Gaza. I've been testifying for a year and a half that there aren't any people to that degree of suffering in Gaza. But there are great discomforts and there are great problems. And I wrote a piece which I thought balanced those two very nicely. And my editor, thankfully, my foreign editor, agreed, and into the paper it went. But on Friday morning, as I was flying to Canada, I landed and found that during the course of the day, there had been an enormous reaction to that story, and particularly to the nature of that lead sentence, suggesting that there wasn't really much of an easing of the blockade, and that it implied that people were somehow suffering more greatly in Gaza and so on. What happened was that there was an effort, and there has been an ongoing effort by the State of Israel, and there have been at other times, from Palestinian points of view, efforts to influence the way people, the articles that people see. And so there was a huge phone-in and writing campaign on Friday against the editors, and they were a little shaken by the volume of it all and said, "Are you sure you really got that balance?" I said, "Believe me." In fact, I was able to point out to them on Friday, the Israeli press itself on Friday pointed out that there was a vast difference between the press release that came from the Israeli cabinet in English and the one that came in Hebrew. The one in English mentioned these very anodyne points that I had quoted in my piece, and the one in Hebrew said that the cabinet reached no agreement. No agreement. That was the nature of the change. There was really no change. So I was able to substantiate it, but that doesn't affect the fact that there were people reacting viscerally to what was written. And so you are, as Martin says, always aware of that. And your editors want to make sure that you are right and that you are somehow balanced. And that's an awkward phrase. I would prefer to think of it as being fair-minded, because sometimes it's all on one side, sometimes it's all on another, and often it's a checkerboard. But fair-mindedness is a pretty good rule of thumb that I've tried to employ, and accuracy above all else, so that at the end of the day, I could stand behind that article and say it was accurate, regardless of the outcry.
I'm always fascinated, I was certainly very fascinated when I was trying to do this myself, by the question of who the audience is. And again, how much you're writing for your own sense of wanting to do justice to the story, and how much for the audience. The Canadian audience, of course, is particular. It's in some ways very cosmopolitan. There's, especially in the metropolitan areas where we have our home offices, highly influenced by large immigration from all over the world, but also to some extent isolated from the rest of the world geographically, and by the fact that Canada faces few of the sort of existential security threats that often decide the foreign policy of less fortunate countries. So the world can sometimes seem like a bit of a luxury or a frippery for Canadians who get to concentrate on home a lot more. With that very long prelude, what are your own reflections on the, I'll start with you, Nahlah, because I also think that the CBC is forced to worry about this maybe more than even the rest of us sometimes, about who the audience is. Who are you talking to when you stare into the camera?
I think, well, okay, well, to back up from that, I think the reason we have foreign correspondents, I think the answer lies in why we have foreign correspondents, because if we didn't want Canadian voices on and to speak to a Canadian audience, we wouldn't send foreign correspondents from here. We would just hire somebody from over there, and that's it, right? So I think the assumption is that the audience is all of Canada and whoever is interested in the subject. But you're right, it is difficult, especially once as a foreign correspondent, you start getting into the story and you start talking to your colleagues who work around you, and you start talking inside baseball and you forget who your audience is. And you start reporting for your colleagues, you start reporting for your boss to make him happy, you start reporting for everybody else but the audience. And that's why foreign correspondents are often asked to come home, and that's why people like me come home, just like diplomats do, because it's necessary to reconnect with your audience, to know who it is that's actually watching you. So yeah, I think those are my views.
Okay. Before we go further, I just want to point out that not too far in the future, you're going to get a chance to ask your own questions. So you should be thinking as you go along of how I'm screwing up, and then you can palliate for those lapses in your own fashion, pretty soon. Martin.
That will allow us to reconnect with our audience.
We can reconnect with our audience, yeah.
People often think about the Middle East in terms of that yin and yang, for and against, those two counterforces. But in Toronto, we have it for many groups, and the one that comes to mind most recently is Sri Lanka, where you have the world's largest diaspora of Sri Lankan Tamils living in Toronto, more than in London, more than in Australia, and they are very engaged. And I certainly hear from them when I write about Sri Lanka. And there's a smaller, much smaller Sinhalese community, and I receive my share of hate mail from them as well. You see how journalists always reflexively try to use that as a balance. You have it also, we have had it in the past with Ukraine. We have it from a lot of groups. That's part of the beat. To answer your question though, we hear about it afterwards, the morning after, but is that who our audience is? I think not. I think for us, we are writing for all Canadians, and I don't wish to lapse into cliche in saying that, but it is very much as you want to be accurate, as much as you have to be aware of the strong knowledge base from a part of your community. You cannot write a specialized article for Tamil Canadians or for Jewish Canadians, Muslim Canadians, Arab Canadians, what have you, Iranian Canadians. You have to think about, I think, give people the full context and paint, if I may put it this way, with broad brushstrokes so that people feel and understand the story as best you can. We can't do that obviously on a daily basis, but I do think, and I often hear this from ethnic communities, from various interest groups in Toronto, well, why aren't you doing more of this or more of that? More of Somalia, for example. There's a very large Somali community in Toronto. And the answer is, we're writing for everybody, and we're trying to give all of our readers what they need to make informed decisions.
Okay. It struck me as I was getting ready for this panel that we would have at this podium two guys who had been both foreign editors and foreign correspondents, and therefore had spent a part of their career yelling down the phone to the opposite end of the line. And I thought I would ask you. Oh, I didn't give you a chance to.
No, that's okay. Please go ahead. I like this yelling down the line stuff.
Was it the guy in Toronto or the guy out in the field who was right? And what are the pressures that the two sides face?
I think Fred Kuntz was there one occasion when I was standing up in the middle of the newsroom yelling down the line at our correspondent in Serbia at the time. He had come in from Moscow, and he is still in the field for us, and he should remain nameless. But we had a huge fight, and I realized at the end of it that the entire newsroom was silent. I won that fight, and it had to do with perspective, as I recall, and the correspondent was often argumentative, and I lost on other occasions because he was persuasive. No, I think we've found, at least to my experience as foreign editor and my experience dealing with foreign editors, we've always had a very sympathetic ear in Toronto for the people in the field, because anyone who's been in the field knows how awkward it is, how difficult it is, how challenging it is. And even if in your heart you think he's making a mistake, you're going to support him at least until the next morning when he begins his next story, when you're going to offer some words of advice. It's a difficult balance, but I think it really is maintained by having the wisdom of the person in the field reflected as best you can in the paper. You know, we're very proud of it being a writer's newspaper over the years. I can tell you it's an editor's paper too. And between what is commissioned and what appears in the paper, both sides are working hard at it. It's generally, though, a deference to the person in the field that has to take place.
Okay. Martin?
Well, I think a foreign editor is a lifeline for a correspondent who's out in the field. You're isolated, you're on the story, you think you know best, and you usually do know best. And it can be frustrating, as Patrick just described from his recent experience in Gaza. When I think about the title of this event tonight, this conversation, Danger, Disasters, and Deadlines, I think that sometimes pertains more to a foreign editor's life than to the foreign correspondent out in the field. I think there is danger, there is often disaster, and there's certainly, you feel the deadlines much more than when you are in another time zone, 7 or so, or 12 hours away, as it was in Hong Kong. Look, I think when I tried to bring a similar perspective. It was sometimes difficult in both jobs. I've actually never been, I didn't sign up to become a war correspondent. I went out to be a foreign correspondent with a little bit of war unavoidably thrown into the mix as events spun out of my control. The same with disasters. Someone was asking at supper earlier about what I hated or found most challenging or most difficult in my work, and it was earthquakes. Earthquakes are such a difficult and traumatic story. You feel powerless. You're there and you're witnessing this utter destruction and you're powerless. And so I didn't get into it for the earthquakes or the disasters or all of that. As a foreign editor, you do find, however, that you become a bit of a prisoner of that rhythm. And you can sometimes lapse into what I used to call, when I was out in the field and being very dismissive of foreign editors who didn't know anything, I used to call it datebook journalism, which is when you sort of put in your datebook or in your Microsoft Outlook the upcoming election anniversary, the political convention, and the upcoming, I don't know, some other event that is, or a disaster, that is something that you can bookmark and that is a touchstone for your coverage. You can plan your coverage around your special section. And I think that can sometimes lead you off of the path of storytelling and narratives and what's happening on the ground, that's less calendar-driven and more event-driven, more human.
Okay. I want to circle back to that distinction between a war correspondent and a foreign correspondent, because I think it deserves to be dwelled on. But I do want to go back to my two foreign editors and ask a question about resources. In your own shops and in Canadian journalism over the long term, is the budget crunch squeezing out the foreign correspondent's work?
I'm happy to say that even in last year's economic crisis, the Globe decided to go ahead with the opening of a bureau in Delhi. It was an additional bureau. Now, I can tell you that it was partly funded by the fact that our Moscow bureau went dark. We still have one there, but there's no one there at the moment. And we positioned our former Moscow correspondent, as many of you know, in Afghanistan for some time. And Graham Smith is currently in Delhi filling in for our Delhi correspondent, who's having a, I better get this right, it's either a book or a baby, I'm not sure which. The resources have been pretty steady because we feel we've demonstrated that the reputation of the Globe and Mail has depended on business coverage, political coverage, and foreign coverage in almost equal parts. The advent of the new media has demonstrated that we've been able to utilize new media pretty successfully. Graham Smith's award-winning series called Talking with the Taliban online was a tremendous move in that direction. We've had others since then. All of us are now beginning to work in the new media, and it's a natural for the foreign bureaus. So we've been able to sustain the economic losses and maintain our bureaus without cutting back. In fact, as far as I know, the money spent on our bureaus has probably grown over the years, not decreased. I know, it is nice.
Martin?
Well, I chuckled a little bit privately when Patrick said dark, because that is a euphemism that journalists, that newsrooms and newspapers and editors use when they're kind of running out of money and trying to juggle the budget a little bit. But hats off to the Globe. They have maintained a very strong commitment to that. Star has I think, done a pretty good job of that over the years in terms of keeping a stable of bureaus open, although some have gone dark from time to time. I remember when we opened a Delhi bureau years ago, and our correspondent was injured, seriously injured in Afghanistan, and that bureau went dark. And I thought of it being a total euphemism, but we did actually reopen a Delhi bureau a couple of years ago. That said, some of our other bureaus have gone dark, so it's a bit of a juggling act. We've had Moscow go dark and Mexico City go dark, but there is light at the end of that tunnel. There is still a commitment, and I think it's a compliment. I'm not just trying to be self-serving here, to both the Globe, the Star, the CBC, and CTV, that have all made a very impressive and very expensive commitment, very costly commitment to foreign coverage, which not every other news organization in this country has done. And the alternative is to lapse into what is sometimes called sort of parachute journalism where someone is parachuted in and we can talk about the contrasts there. But it is expensive and it is an amazing commitment. I don't know how much longer it will last despite the best efforts. When I went abroad with my wife and I, when we arrived in the Middle East, we said, it feels as if we're the last of the Mohicans, that there won't be any more after us. And indeed, many have fallen and many have gone dark. We were talking about Nahlah was just in Jerusalem a while back and saw how so many other bureaus have either disappeared or have shrunken. So, yeah.
How's it going at the CBC now?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to hear it on the newspaper side because it is quite different in television, partly because television is extremely expensive to begin with. And we tend to move in packs, so packs cost money and every one of us needs a hotel room and all of that. But the difficult thing is, let me just tell you about this past 2 weeks in Israel and in Gaza. I was filling in for Margaret Evans, who I'm sure you all know, very well-respected foreign correspondent in Jerusalem. But I was filling in for her in Jerusalem, and in the mornings I was filing 2 pieces for radio, and in mid-morning I was doing hits for News World. And then there's a little tiny break in there where we could run out and talk to people on the street, and then come back and start working on the nighttime piece. It wasn't every day that we had original material, but on most of the days we didn't. We were using wire material. We'd have to be very deliberate when we wanted to do an original story. For example, going to Gaza, we had to tell the 4 or 5 services at the CBC, well, you know what, the correspondent's not going to be around. You're not going to be served for the next 2 days because we're going to actually go and get original material. And so what's changed is that we're doing a lot with a lot less. And I would venture to say that on a story that we just had with the Gaza flotilla, that if we had had the normal configuration where we had somebody in the Arab world, like myself, I used to be based in Beirut, and then someone in Jerusalem, that someone would have stayed in Israel and covered what's going on there and maybe gone down to Gaza, and the Arab world correspondent might have gone on to Turkey to talk about the really interesting change in the politics of that country. We didn't do that now, and so that's changed. And I can honestly tell you, it's not a CBC thing, it's a TV thing, as Martin said, that friends of mine at ABC, ABC, the network in Jerusalem, used to be 40 people when I first arrived in the Middle East. That was more than 7 years ago. Now there are 4, and 3 of them have just been asked to go half-time. The last time that I was actually assigned to what we call an enterprise endeavor, or an enterprise assignment, as in go to a country, tell me some stories, was in 2004. So the resources in TV are definitely dwindling.
Yeah. And it's the same story all over, if I could just interject. A friend of mine was a foreign correspondent for Time magazine for 20 years. And when I arrived in Paris in 2007, Time was closing its Paris bureau, pulling him. He was like the last survivor. They pulled him back to London. 2 years later, they shut essentially the London bureau, except for 1 correspondent, and he finally got whacked. And he's working at AOL now and feels lucky to have a job anywhere. I have looked on the websites of press clubs around the world. The legendary Shanghai Press Club is just desperate for members because there used to be just hundreds of people in Shanghai from news organizations around the world. And German newspapers are in a crisis, French newspapers are in a slightly less acute crisis, and there's a lot less room for, maybe not the top agenda story, but a little bit lower down on the agenda. It's not as easy as it used to be.
There is good news in Hong Kong. It has a spectacular foreign correspondence club. It has expanded, it's renovated, it's a storied place. John le Carré has written about it for his spy novels. That's the good news. The bad news is there's only about 1% of the membership that is actually journalists. The rest are all bankers and lawyers and public relations executives. So it's doing very well, though.
I was going to say that there are 2 risks that are involved when this kind of tendency happens. The advent of new media has been a godsend in many ways, but it has also brought about the notion of, forgive me, citizen journalism. Now, some citizens are very diligent and will shoot something with their camera and put it online, and they'll be careful. But more often than not, of course, it'll be not necessarily a representative nor an accurate picture that is shown by whoever may be managing that aspect of the media at any given time. The medium is ripe for pillage by foreign organizations, by various interest groups, and you have to be very careful of just who is actually telling you the stories. The second thing that happens in a cutback era like this is people decide to go with locally engaged staff as opposed to the foreign correspondent. And there is an easy temptation to do that in a place like Israel, where there are many English-speaking people, many people from the West, who can identify with the news organizations back home to a degree. But there are all kinds of other pressures that are brought to bear on such individuals as that, government and other pressures locally, that might incidentally or deliberately, or perhaps not so deliberately, influence that reporter's work. I think it's essential that this role, if people in Canada and people around the world wish to have a more accurate and fair-minded presentation of facts on the ground, that they'll have to have those people in the field. Now, we can share resources, we can double up with people. I did some stuff for CTV in the absence of their correspondent a while ago, and you can stretch your own time to a certain degree. But nothing is going to replace that person that is sent out by your news organization, put it on the field. Nothing.
I do now want to get back to this distinction between war correspondent and foreign correspondent. All of you who served in the Middle East, which is an area of constant danger, a country, Israel, under constant existential threat, and conflict that escalates frequently into lethal violence. The largest news gallery in the world is in Brussels, the seat of the European Union. 1,600 correspondents from all across Europe, but also all around the world. There's one Canadian accredited to that gallery, and he writes for the Associated Press out of the United States. Because there's days in Brussels where you dream that maybe you'd find some conflict that rises above bureaucratic, and yet it's extremely important. Do you ever get satisfaction as a reporter from telling the more mundane stories of finance and governance and just the human stories, lifestyle pieces? And do you ever face pushback from your desk when you say, I would like to miss a day of this conflict so I could do a day of this society? Nahlah.
I think it's for me, it was, the simplest way to put it is that it was just another facet of life there. And not to diminish, obviously, the great toll that violence, whether it's a couple of days or a couple of months, that takes on the people of the region, but it is just another facet of life there. And so if you purport to be a foreign correspondent who is based in the Middle East, you can't exactly walk away when there's a conflict. And so I definitely never set out to be a war correspondent. I mean, I never set out to be a correspondent at all. I was in genetics. I was doing my master's in genetics when this crazy idea came to me. But it is part and parcel of being there. And so it's unavoidable, and it's an important facet of life because it happens and it shapes people's perceptions of everything. It shapes people's personalities. I think we used to joke, I mean, we can have sometimes some pretty strange sense of humor, but not joke, but we used to talk about the fact, I swear that the entire region has PTSD. And it's true. A lot of people have been through a lot of conflict, and it doesn't have to be bombs going off outside your window, but it's just going through, reading about it, going through, worrying about it. So it really affects people on a daily basis. And so to understand the region, you've got to cover the conflicts, but you've also got to cover the little stories about art and music and the kinds of things they do when they're not engaged in conflict. So it's all part and parcel of it.
Martin, how do you juggle?
Well, I think it's really important, especially out of deference to you and to Bill Graveland, to draw a distinction between the two kinds of foreign reporting that we have now. One is Afghanistan. We are a country more or less at war or involved in a military conflict in Afghanistan. And I wouldn't want to minimize at all the importance of that and to honor the reporting and to describe the importance of that mission, in my opinion. Setting aside Afghanistan, which has preoccupied us for the last few years, I personally have a view of foreign reporting that ought to be different. I'm speaking mostly for the written press. As print journalists, we don't have to have images that are right on the front lines or the flashpoints. And so I think there is value that we can add, especially in the world we live in now, of the internet, where news is freely available. You can get AFP or AP or Reuters online at any time, almost commoditized news. If you want to know what happened with the earthquake in Haiti, you can get as much Haiti earthquake as you want. What I think our newspaper tries to do, and I think Patrick's and the CBC, when they let you, is to give people more context and more analysis. Those are, perhaps not to this audience, turn-off words sometimes. It sounds dreary and sometimes too cerebral. Another way of putting it is to just tell stories, to give these events a narrative arc so that they can, so that you can give our readers, our Canadian readers, a sense of you are there. I think the problem with thinking of it in the paradigm of disasters and danger is that you can end up chasing your tail. When I was in the Middle East originally, or when Patrick was there originally, and when I was there in the late 90s, suicide bombings were a relatively rare phenomenon. Relatively. They were pioneered in Sri Lanka by the Tamil Tigers and imported and adapted by Hamas's military brigade, Izzadin al-Qassam. You had roadside bombs being used by Hezbollah in South Lebanon and Katyushas, but the violence and the bombings were not quite as commonplace. My goodness, after 9/11, the Iraq War, the number of suicide bombings and attacks on civilians throughout the world, throughout South Asia, throughout the Middle East, is just mind-boggling. I should say that there was a lot of it happening, I want to correct myself, in the late 90s in North Africa, in Algeria, where there was a civil war underway as well. And by the way, that's one point I want to work in, a segue, is that those attacks got very little coverage. It's not because the media, in my opinion, as some might suggest, valued Israeli lives more than Algerian lives. It's that there were so many foreign correspondents based in Jerusalem. Almost, I can't back this up with numbers, but speaking anecdotally, second surely to Brussels in terms of the number of foreign correspondents per square inch. And so when they were on location, they were able to describe very graphically what was going on at a time when there was great interest in the kind of the thinking behind suicide bombings and the aftermath. Now it's so commonplace we barely pay attention. There can be 2 or 3 or 4 a day.
Okay. Have you ever been scared for your life? Patrick?
Yes. Yep. In Iraq in 2004, it was the headhunting season when correspondents were sometimes among the people that were abducted. Sometimes they were Russian technicians, sometimes they were Korean diplomats. Various people were being taken, and I remember the day I flew into Baghdad for a month-long stay. The newspaper that day had a picture of a East Asian journalist who was pictured with the people behind him with the knife that would be used to cut off his head. And that was how I was preparing to sit down in Baghdad. The time there was a little frazzled and hectic. I felt generally safe enough with the people who were working with me, and I didn't have any armed guard or any other kinds of security other than the hotel in which I stayed, which was part of a small compound, not the green zone, but a small compound that I think most of us have been at, the Hamra Hotel, which would subsequently be bombed, but twice now. But at the time it was relatively safe. But the day I was really frightened was the day I decided to go to Najaf in the south of Iraq, and colleagues were saying, "You're crazy, no one's been down there for months." I really felt that I was secure enough. And if we left early enough in the day and we got through the area called Mahmoudiyah, south of Baghdad, we'd be just fine. So we left really early, and sure enough, we hit Mahmoudiyah, and we hit a traffic jam at 6 o'clock in the morning we hadn't anticipated. And I sat there, I was in a keffiyeh, and with a beard in the keffiyeh, sitting in the back seat. I looked relatively local. I was a beat-up old Chev, and my 2 guys were in the front. They were Shiites. But as we sat there in the heat, and people kept walking by and peering into the back, who was the sheikh in the back seat? I think my blue eyes or something else about me probably gave me away. We got very uncomfortable. The driver tried to speed away. He went down a lane thinking he could avoid traffic. It was a dead end. He came back. He succeeded in drawing only more attention to us. That was the day I was really, very frightened. And I remembered something that a former foreign correspondent of the Globe and Mail told me, Linda Hosey. She was a veteran of wars in Central America, and she said, don't get killed for color. The point is, if it's the basic part of your story and you're in danger, you can justify it. But if you're only going out there to get some kind of colorful anecdote to dress up your story, don't do it. On that day, I wondered if I had made a mistake. I survived, as you can tell, and I was happy I did. But that was the day I was scared.
Okay. Nahlah, I'll open it up to a Chinese menu. Either a moment when you felt that you were personally in danger, or a story that you would put on your highlight reel that did not involve violence or the potential for violence, but instead showed some context about the society that you were covering.
One or the other?
Yeah, or both.
Okay, I'll do it really quick.
Okay.
There were several parts over 7 years where I thought I was about to lose my life, but the most dangerous was falling off the roof, actually, of the Palestine Hotel, trying to do live. It was that had nothing to do with bombs or
It's in Baghdad, by the way, the Palestine Hotel.
What's that?
The Palestine Hotel in Baghdad, right?
Yeah, in Baghdad, yeah. Once, and some of you might know about this because I've written about this, but I like talking about it as a form of therapy, but I was beaten up in a crowd shortly after Ashura bombings back in 2004. You might remember a couple of hundred people died on that day, the first time Shia Muslims were able to celebrate, or to mark a very important religious holiday. And it wasn't really me, it was, the bombings went off, people died, and anyone who looked like they didn't belong got beaten up, and that included me, because yes, I do speak Arabic, but ultimately I'm Canadian, and I walk a certain way, and I carry a backpack, and so I didn't belong, and so we all got bruises and bloody noses. But I thought I was going to die that day because someone pulled a gun on us, and I was saved somehow by a man. Anyway, but the other question was a story. Yes, I did a story once, and I couldn't believe the reaction to this because you think you're so important when you're covering bombs and explosions and the liberation of Baghdad, and then you do a story about a doll called Fulla. Have you ever heard about this? It's like the Arab equivalent of Barbie, made by Syrians, of all people. A boss of mine sent me this email, said, do this story. So I'm like, but I did it, and I got dozens and dozens and dozens of emails because it was a slice of life. It was something that Mrs. Jones in Winnipeg could relate to because she buys dolls for her daughter. And it said a little bit about the culture because this was a doll that looked more like me than it did, a Barbie. It had brown hair and some more olivey skin, and moms loved buying it for their daughters. So it told a little story about life. So that was, I thought, a pretty good bit of context.
Very good. Martin, same menu.
I didn't hear the second part of your question. A story we're proud of that did not involve? Is that?
Yeah, so the story, basically the high adrenaline moment, and or a story that you did that got away from the sort of ambulance chasing aspect and got into some of the richer elements of the work that we hope we can do.
The scariest moment of my life during 11 years abroad was every time I got into a car and there was somebody else behind the wheel. And driving is truly a terrifying experience in a lot of these countries. It just is.
Yes.
I don't necessarily mean in Gaza or Lebanon, although it can be, but on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where more people die than in any terrorist or suicide bombing. In Israel, everybody thinks they're an F-16 pilot when they're behind the wheel. I don't like talking about danger, so I won't talk about it other than to say, again, in this driving context, during the tsunami, when I was in Sri Lanka, we went as far as we could, which was to the other end of the island, did what I felt we had to do, was report on the devastation, report on some of the political maneuvering that was depriving, we thought, some of the Tamil community of aid that should have gone their way. And on the drive back, the roads were flooded, and I just was positive our road, there was just like a gushing waterfall almost of coming across the road, and I just thought I was going to go over. So those are the ones I was always truly white-knuckled about. The other stuff, as I say, I just won't talk about it. The story I was proudest of was what we would call an enterprise or investigative story about how, and the Star gave me a lot of time to do it, and I took a lot of flack for it, about how a lot of Jewish settlements in Israel were the beneficiaries of donations from Canadians who were getting tax receipts from the Canadian registered charities that were then sending money to this or that settlement. And the story kind of tracked, I won't call them front organizations, but organizations that were, as I say, claiming charitable status, claiming that these were, and they were, by the way, it was relief work, but it was in an area of the occupied territories that Canada believed to be illegal settlements as a matter of foreign policy. And that story took a lot of legwork, and I was really quite pleased with it. I'll stop there.
Patrick, I'm going to let you talk about one of these stories because I opened it up to a broader menu after you told us your life-threatening moment. I will only say that as soon as he's done, we're going to turn it over to the floor.
Let's go to the floor.
For questions from the floor. So as a matter of fact, Patrick has never written a story that didn't involve risk and danger to his person.
Nothing I've been proud of, that's the point.
So we're going to cover for that by asking you, what would you like to ask these folks up here about the work that we do, about the society within which we function, the industry that we're working in? What have you been burning to ask? And I would emphasize, there's a microphone here at the middle of the floor, I emphasize my distinct preference for questions that aren't prefaced with long lectures.
With what? Sorry?
We've had...
This won't be a long preface. I've noticed in a lot of Canadian journalists, both print, the CBC, for radio, for television, that we will cover the French elections, we will cover the big gaffe that Gordon Brown made, we will cover the Middle East, we will cover certain things in South America. But with the exception of many people dying, I don't hear anything about Botswanan elections. I don't hear anything about what's happening in Cameroon. I don't hear anything about Côte d'Ivoire. I hear absolutely nothing from a non-disaster standpoint that comes out of Africa. And I would like to know if this is a conscious effort for a variety of reasons or a particular reason, or if this is based on a history of a Canadian appetite for, or lack of appetite for, the entire continent.
May I?
Yeah, the Globe did Africa about a month ago. But.
Well, we have a full-time correspondent, of course, in Africa, Jeff York. He's the one I was shouting down the line to that time, by the way, in East Africa, but he's terrific. Jeff is in Africa, and we have been in Africa for a long, long time, but he is one person trying to cover an entire continent, and so he doesn't get everywhere. However, he did just in the last month cover the elections in Sudan, if I'm not mistaken. I was watching from another perch, but as I recall, he was there for some time setting them up. So indeed, he does go to different parts of that continent and present news as he sees is required. He's obviously right now caught up with a World Cup celebration and everything else, but he's made a pretty good foray around the region, including a lot of time in Central Africa where a lot of people don't go, partly because of the adoption of a Canadian diplomat there a couple of years ago, and he unraveled a lot of the story after the fact. It was a tale that earned him an award for his work. Jeff is tireless and does get around, but your point is right. We don't pay as much attention to that continent as we do just about any other, in fact, any other continent except Australia. So I think your concern is well-founded, but in our case, we do have someone working constantly on that one particular area.
I'm not going to run the table for every question, but does anyone else want in on that? I think it's fair to say that the logistical challenges are multiplied almost most places in Africa, but the implied point of the question I think is well taken. Next.
A bit of a double-barreled question. If I may ask you to reflect upon your work and the way you do it, it was mentioned earlier, this speed, the deadlines, the new technology. So you're pressed all the time to come up with something. And yet that desire somehow to produce a piece that's reflective, that really begins to get at the underlying reality of what it is that you observe in your own site. What is it that frustrates you, that if you can reflect upon that in terms of just the way the technology has evolved, that perhaps takes away from, let's call it, the deeper reflective pieces that begin to get at some of the substantial aspects of the reality. And if I may just end the question, imagine another generation, or Patrick Martin Mark II, another 30 years hence. Do you see any sliver in this crisis, certainly the Middle East, that it's become boring, it's peaceful, and there's really nothing to report from there?
Okay, so two questions about the long term, in a sense. Now, sure, absolutely.
I find, is this working? Hello?
It wasn't.
No, it's not.
Nahlah,
Yes.
we got her?
Hello? It's good? Okay. So for me, it was actually, no, you can't. No, they can't hear me. Test. No, now it's working. Okay?
It doesn't sound like it.
Try that. Okay, that's working. Sorry, it's not actually not that pithy of an answer, but I thought it's actually quite interesting. It was new technology in my case that made it possible to talk about all those, the context. Because as you know, in a television piece, it's extremely difficult to get much across than what you see in the pictures, and a few words to sort of augment, I guess, the meaning. But it was the internet that, in my second or third year in the Middle East, that finally actually gave me a place to vent my frustration and to talk about the nuances and to talk about context. Because once again, I became a newspaper reporter, and I could do my 2-minute piece for TV and then turn it around and write a 1,000-word, contextual piece for the internet. So in a way, new technology made it easier for me. It's just different.
I should note that we're all chuckling up here because we all had exactly the same problems with these headset mics last year when we went on tour as backup singers for Avril Lavigne. It almost ruined the Montreal gig. Martin, the more reflective side of the story, but also that question, is there anything that you've seen in your time in the Middle East that leads you to think that we'll be able to shut the bureaus one day?
Other than cash flow, you mean?
Yeah.
Right. Yes, I hope so. I think those are both good questions. Let me quickly answer technology, and I hope my microphone is working. I think the challenge is for editors and reporters to not allow themselves to be prisoners of that technology, and that is, I grant you, harder than it sounds. Sometimes it takes sabotage. I one time just didn't answer my phone when I was in a very important, to me, very valuable assignment in Sri Lanka. A bomb went off in another part of the world, and I, like JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I just pretended that the message never arrived from Khrushchev. On the Middle East and the 100 Years' War, look, I'm always wrong. With that caveat aside, I do believe there will be a time when we can close down the bureaus, not for financial reasons. I offer as evidence Sri Lanka, not a happy ending necessarily, but a conflict that went on for 25 or 30 years almost has pretty much come to an end, I think forever, and probably for the best, despite all the incredible suffering. It can happen. It almost happened. We were talking about this in the car ride down. When I was there was very much the prospect of peace in the Middle East. As soon as Patrick left, in fact, things really calmed. Things really calmed down. There was no more shouting on the phone, and there was, despite the problems and the occasional suicide bombings, by which I mean every few months, there was so much hope in the air. Suffering as well, political spoilers on the part of Hamas, who did not want to play ball, but both sides seemed so committed. There was an assassination of Rabin while I was there, so it wasn't always universal commitment, but it just seemed there was no turning back. I admit I was a true believer. I was dead wrong, but at a certain point, both sides will exhaust themselves in the Middle East for the simple reason that everyone knows what the solutions will more or less be. It's not hard as a mapping exercise to figure out the trade-offs that will take place, and they will be trade-offs, whether it's right of return or Jerusalem or borders and redrawing the borders and contiguity. I do think a prerequisite to peace in the Middle East, and I'm not trying to be mischievous here, would be for Hamas and Fatah to start getting along, because until that happens, you have a bit of a problem. So it's complicated, but at some point, I do believe it will happen.
I can't let the moment pass without saying something. I share with Martin the belief that we can all see how it could work. And I felt this way for a long time, since Yossi Beilin and Abu Mazen sat down together and drafted a proposal for the Palestinians and Israelis to live together in peace, sharing that territory as it was once intended in 1947. However, I've become a little worried. No, worried isn't, I'm detached, I don't care. I believe now that it is not certain. I believe now that there may not be the critical mass any longer sufficient to pull that off. And I mean it on both sides. Life is getting better for a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank, and even in Gaza there is the prospect of one day Hamas actually being talked to and making arrangements. But I've talked to too many people who harbor such great hatred and contempt for the other on both sides that I'm not sure. I think their numbers may be growing, not diminishing. I think the growth of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, and not just that they're religious, but that they're being coupled increasingly with the religious Zionist movement in the settlements and elsewhere, is one of those tendencies that should give people pause if they think it's going to happen easily. I think that there is now a new makeup of the population in Israel and some new attitudes in Palestine which have to be reconciled. They're only talking in proximity talks right now. They're a long way from actually negotiating. Despite the best wishes of the American president and others, I don't see this coming together very quickly. Now, on the deeper question about 200 years from now, this thing's gone on for more than 100 years. It's gone on for about 5,000 years, and that is how people of the region see it. And I think that you're going to continue to see it for another 5,000. When God was once asked by a South African black and by an Irish Catholic, if there ever be peace in their particular countries, God said, yes, there will, but not in your lifetime, my son. But when an Israeli or a Palestinian asked the same question, he said, yeah, but not in my lifetime. I suspect that's probably the case.
I'm going to invoke moderator's privilege and give my own answer to the first question, which was more mundane, and it was the influence of new technology on the work we do. I just want to say it's not only, my experience is like Nahlah's, the internet is not only and always an accelerating influence. It can be a place where we can dump our reflections that might not be hot enough for the main publication. Maclean's is concerned with beating the continent-wide trend towards the death of weekly news magazines, and therefore we like to put stuff in the magazine that large numbers of people will want to write. But I have a lot of stuff in my head that is the other kind of stuff, and I often use my blog for that, for long reflections, to try out arguments to see how they read, and then get feedback from readers, and refine those maybe for a more condensed exposure in the print magazine and so on. So the blog is not always the short, sharp hit. The blog can often be where we test drive or simply find a home for the stuff that wouldn't make the cut if it was in the more competitive race for the print publication. I just wanted to make that point.
So your blog is like a beta. It's Paul Beta, and then the 2.0 is in the magazine?
Yeah, it's Paul Wells Unbound, so it has a restrained but enthusiastic audience.
How is Canadian media coverage of the Middle East crisis affected by the fact that there's a large concentration of pro-Israel media companies such as CanWest Global, and also most of the foreign correspondents are living in Israel, and they would have their children going to school there and that sort of thing. So how would that affect their coverage of the crisis?
Anyone?
The influence of the pro-Israeli or the Canadian Jewish community that is sympathetic to Israel is not the only political force in the country. There's a growing and substantial population that is sympathetic to the other point of view, and not just of Palestinians, but to the wider Arab world. So I think it'd be wrong to think of the only political force at work here in this country being a pro-Israeli force. How does it affect? It affected, as we spoke about earlier, that is, with respect to our being sure of our facts and our accuracy and our fair-mindedness. I'm sorry, the last part of your question was about children. I've done 2 stints in the Middle East. In the first stint, my children did go to school there. They went to the Anglican school in Jerusalem, which was populated by international organizations, the children of international people. There were Palestinians, Israelis, but mostly there were Ghanaians and Finns and others who sent their children there. So I don't think that had any kind of adverse effect on how we approached the subject, because they were in a bit of a shell there, a bit of an island from detached to some degree, although we had to school them in how to get home if there was a riot, rock throwing incident, tear gas, how to deal with these things. But apart from that, there was no influence, I think, on how we approached the story. Now I'm there on my own. My kids are all back here in Canada, and I'm there by myself. It makes me a freer actor. I don't have to go and coach Little League behind the YMCA on Tuesday nights, but it means I can go, where I need to go a little more freely. But as for effect on the writer, I don't believe that it matters one way or the other.
Yeah, because I used to work at the National Post. I'm as close as you're going to get to a CanWest representative up here. One day they fired a boss that I liked, so I quit. But until then, I do think it's fair to. I don't think it's sort of that linear that a Zionist proprietor requires a Zionist coverage. But I have had occasion to note in the months and years after, immediately after 9/11, that some elements of the debate were far more simplistic to the point of caricature in the conservative Canadian press in a way that they never were in the conservative American or British press. When the big question was, should we go into Baghdad and take out Saddam, in the vernacular of my colleagues at the Post, I was allowed every once in a while to squeak out a note of skepticism. As a matter of fact, I could have written that this was folly every day for months on end, but there's a sort of a community of opinion, and that was not the community of opinion at the National Post at the time. I couldn't help notice that in the virulently pro-Bush Daily Telegraph in London and the Spectator magazine in London, and in the news columns of American newspapers, there was far more room for a complex conversation, which often included open disagreement with the policy, than there was in the cartoonishly flag-waving National Post, which was paying my mortgage at the time. That disappointed me. I am pleased that my former Post editor, Ken White, having followed me to Maclean's is a far more congenial home for a diversity of opinions on these questions than the National Post used to be. Ken realizes that we are now the mainstream media. We are not assaulting a fragmented market from the right. My friend Mark Stein gets to write what he thinks, and I get to write what I think, and more often than in the old days, we get to acknowledge that we almost never agree. I think that's as should be. I'll stop there. That only begins to answer your question, but there's a lot of possible answers to your question. Maybe someone else has an answer.
It's not an unreasonable question. The Toronto Telegram in 1967 sent a rabbi to cover the Six-Day War. He may have been a very progressive rabbi, but he probably did have some baggage. I said earlier, and I'll say again, I think having interest groups on either side keeps us on our toes and hopefully doesn't intimidate us in either way. I think it's legitimate to ask about correspondents who have kids in the Israeli army. They tend to be locally engaged staff, as I think Patrick was intimating earlier. That's a fair question. If you're interested in it, you can look at the online at the New York Times, where their public editor or ombudsman, I forget what they call it, dealt with the issue of Ethan Bronner, whom Patrick and I both know to be quite a remarkable correspondent. As you may know, sir, there was a controversy about him, his children serving in the Israeli army. No, so that's another debate. The Toronto Star has been boycotted by a funeral home. As I understand it, it may have changed, but at last I looked, there was a long-standing boycott by a funeral home that primarily serves the Jewish community in Toronto. That boycott started a long time ago, I think while I was in the Middle East, so in the late 1990s, and as far as I know, it's still in effect. And as far as I can tell, it hasn't affected the Star's coverage. It's a widespread view, and I'm just going to tell a story, which I do not mean in any way to denigrate your question. I think it's a fair question. When I was in Beirut, after a lot of hard work, lobbying, listening to recitations of poetry and so on, I obtained an interview with the leader of Hezbollah, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, who's still the leader of Hezbollah. That would have been in roughly 1996 or 7, just before the last Lebanon War, or penultimate Lebanon War, the Grapes of Wrath conflict. And before the interview started, his handler, a guy named Ibrahim, said, well, okay, you're going to get the interview. This took, as I say, about a week of lobbying. I need to ask you some questions first about your newspaper, the Toronto Star. He said, what can you tell me about the Toronto Star? And I said, well, it's a progressive newspaper. It cares, it fights for social justice. It's an independently owned paper. It's not part of a chain, and it's the largest daily newspaper in Canada. I could tell that didn't satisfy him, and he said, no. I mean, how many Jews work at the newspaper? Now, some of you may have noticed I have a Jewish surname, but I don't think Ibrahim had figured that out. I was Martin Reg Khan. And he said, and I said, well, Ibrahim, it's about typical for any Canadian newspaper. And he said, no. I mean, how many Zionists are at the newspaper? And I said, well, I'm sure if you looked at the Toronto Star and Can West and Globe and Mail, you'd see it's about the same, probably. I haven't actually looked at it. And he was satisfied with that, and the interview went ahead. When the interview was over, he said, make sure, as you promised, to fax me a copy of the article, and here is my fax number. And I took his card and I added it to the pile of other cards I had in my pocket. Unfortunately, the top card was my Lebanese government press accreditation. Oh. And at the top, it had my name, and they had organized it. Perhaps it's a European influence as nom de famille, so family name first, and then given names. So he saw Khan, Martin Reg, and he looked and he said, took the card out of my hand, in fact, and said, Cohen, that's your name? And I said, yes, Ibrahim, it is. But that's your family name? It's not Reg Khan? And I said, no, it's Khan, that's right. And he said, but that is a Jewish name. And I said, yes. So you are a Jew? And I said, yes, Ibrahim, I am. Now, I could tell just by looking at his eyes that it was a question of who was in greater jeopardy, me for having just been in the sanctum sanctorum of Hezbollah, or Ibrahim for having let me in there in the first place. And so he simply looked at me, and I could tell him he was making that calculation, and he said, no problem, we are not fanatics here. And he gave me back my card and hustled me out of the office, and I lived to tell the tale. So.
He's still there, by the way. Ibrahim, he's okay.
He's running the television network now, I think, right? El Manar, yeah.
Next.
Are there distinctives about the Canadian voice in foreign journalism or foreign correspondence that make the continuation of that Canadian voice essential, not only for our nation, but also for the world?
Are there, I didn't hear the second word. Are there what?
Distinctives?
Distinctive. Nahlah.
You're not.
She is the distinctive voice, is it? Oh, of course.
It's not Sunday morning, Patrick. You can't just sort of.
If I understood the question correctly, I think just like any other Canadian, we like to think that we are different than Americans or the Brits or the French. And I think there is actually in journalism a difference. It's not, I don't think it's readily apparent if you read one article to the next, but I think if you look at the breadth of coverage or the long-term way that we cover things and the tone with which we cover things, it is different. I'd have to think about some examples though, so I'll leave it at that. But I would say there is a distinct Canadian voice, and it is the argument for why we should have Canadians bringing the news to Canadians. Let me think of an example.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go first, just because an example comes to mind. First of all, let me say that American correspondents, who tend to predominate by virtue of sheer numbers and population, a lot of them tend to be pretty spectacularly good correspondents. Just as a starter, they are pretty highly qualified and dedicated people at the top of their profession. I really believe that. Definitely, there is a distinctive Canadian temperament and perspective, I think. I think certainly on the Middle East, you can see differences, perhaps not as much as you might expect, but there are differences. I think I think for Canadians, when you talk about a Canadian voice, or there's also a Canadian eye, I think we see things differently, not because we're better than Americans, but we just are more conscious of our own, for want of a better word, national interest or national traditions. Peacekeeping being the most obvious one, although I think that's sometimes overstated. But there is a Canadian way of seeing the world. It's informed by multiculturalism. It's informed by the French fact in Canada. It's informed by immigration and refugee issues. I certainly see the Australian immigration and refugee determination system differently as a Canadian, because we don't have detention camps in Canada, by and large, for immigrants. We sometimes detain them, but under extraordinary circumstances. Sorry, refugees, not immigrants. In Australia, it's been bipartisan policy, liberal and conservative, to put people in camps, as many of you would know. So that's the kind of thing that a Canadian would see differently.
Patrick? Because again, I want to answer, so I'll let you all answer. Well, I am skeptical about any impression. I would not want to give any impression that I think Canadians should be out there doing foreign correspondent work, because there's something particularly laudable in the Canadian soul that would otherwise go lacking in the world of journalism. I always feel a little angry when I go to a Chapters store and I see the signs up everywhere saying the world needs more Canada. Depending on the day, my reaction is either did we ask the world before we put that poster up? And sometimes when I'm a little less chippy, I think that simply the Canadians could almost always stand to be more worldly rather than the other way around. That being said, and with that sort of firm caveat, we are family. We get each other's references. We're thinking about something before we turn the page to the next story or got to the next item on the nightly news. And Canadians will have a better chance of hooking what's going on in the world back to our references than other people would. The reason this is even a question is that we all do our work in English, and that it is very easy for our employers to take the New York Times wire or to run BBC stuff or whatever, and we have to keep making the case that it is our ability to refer a debate somewhere in the world to a debate that is happening or has happened or might yet happen in Canada that makes that work worth doing. I don't think it's the Canadian soul, I just think it's the Canadian conversation that makes our work worth doing.
Paul, I just want to add one point too. I think, well, I've thought of an example, but I think the fact, and then this is often talked about in foreign policy as well, that Canada doesn't have a history of colonialism. You know what I'm trying to say. I'm jet lagged. we don't have a history of violence, we don't have a history of war, with the exception, putting Afghanistan aside, when we're covering a particular conflict, generally speaking, we've never been party to it. And I think that informs our journalism. It changes the way we cover things as compared to how the Americans cover them or the British do. And certainly in the Middle East it does, because we come to it sort of almost as outsiders. Because Canada doesn't really have a long history in the Middle East, certainly not a violent history. And so I think that is a huge difference between how we look at things and how Americans, for example, would look at things.
Next question.
Sort of like to engage this topic that we're talking about right now. Canada has maintained a record of participation in conflicts overseas for a long time, since the 1960s. Particularly the last 20 years with UN peacekeeping operations such as Bosnia, Haiti. Currently, we're in Afghanistan. So, given that fact, foreign correspondence has shifted around the world with Canadian forces. I'm curious how coverage of Canadian soldiers in overseas conflicts has affected or mitigated the latitude of your coverage. I feel that when you are following Canadian soldiers, that you have one foot in an operation or an overseas conflict, as well as one foot in Canadian society, given that it is a very, it's an issue that Canadians are very much interested in, politically, but also personally, because they have maybe friends or family. So how has that affected your writing, by being aware that you are there personally in a conflict, but you're also having a stake in what's happening politically in Canada at the same time?
I guess you're asking about what it's like to be embedded. Is that essentially what you're? I mean, it's sort of been the long-standing debate ever since September 11th is what to embed or not to embed. But obviously we're well beyond that, because as news organizations we're quite present in Afghanistan. And generally speaking, when we say we're going to Afghanistan, it means we're going to a military base. I was there, I haven't been there recently, but I was there when the first Canadians, well actually when it was barely a base, when there was no Tim Hortons or Burger King, there was this little soup stall that we would go to warm up, and that was it. But it is a very different way of working, absolutely, because there are rules of engagement, so to speak. There are release forms that you have to sign before you actually can live on a base, and that tell you very specifically that if you report something that could compromise security of the troops or operational security, that you are out. And so I think just simply by virtue of that, it changes the way you report. There is something as getting too close as well. There's the danger of that. You're sleeping in the same, well, not quite in the same quarters, but on the same base. You're eating the same food. You're living in the same environment. It is something that you have to think about on a daily basis, is not to get too close. Again, I haven't been there for several years, but for us, the way to do it was to stick together as journalists. And though we share an experience and we talk about it at the end of the day, we make friends, colleagues, or acquaintances among the soldiers, that we are still guests there. And I think several news organizations will actually pay a sum of money, if I'm not mistaken, to cover our expenses of being there as well, so that there's absolutely no attempt at making it sound like we're there on a free ride. So
I won't add much, especially because we're going to get pretty close to wrapping up. I will just say it's really hard not to write more sympathetically about what soldiers do after you spend time with soldiers, simply because they are so impressive. I didn't grow up in a military family. I don't feel any need because my employer proclaims any kind of cheap road patriotism to talk about the valor and dedication of our soldiers. But our soldiers are valorous and dedicated, and it is really hard for that not to come through every time I spend time with them. I might as well just admit that, so you can factor that in as you read my copy going forward. One last question that we're going to try and race through, and then...
Can I quickly... Patrick, yeah. I have to say one thing about that. I have been among those who have been opposed to the notion of embeddedness. I protested against it at the Globe and Mail when and generally speaking, apart from Afghanistan now, where we have a moderate amount of embeddedness there, we've stuck to that. I think that it is impossible to cover adequately when you are embedded or really close to people. And as I was driving down here today with Bronwyn, She reminded me of something I once told an Israeli who was interrogating me at the airport, who wanted to know, what kind of friends I had in East Jerusalem, what kind of friends I had in Ramallah and Gaza and so on. And I said, I have no friends, I'm a journalist. And he understood. I think it's the only way to maintain real sufficient detachment is to maintain a policy, as Nahlah says, of being close to fellow journalists, of being close perhaps to diplomats, of being close to people who share with you that sense of needing to be detached. I think it's terribly dangerous to follow the path of even your own soldiers. I've only covered Canadian soldiers in the Golan Heights when I went up to interview some people when they were still there and in Cyprus. On no other occasion have I done so. Those were not points of conflict or embeddedness or anything else, but it was just to fact find on those occasions. But I think it's imperative that we stay removed.
Okay. If we deal with your question briefly, it won't be because of the quality of the question, but just because of the time on the clock.
Okay.
I want to say that before you talk, so go.
All right, sure. I just have two very quick questions, and you can, whoever wants to address them, they can. The first one is technology related, and it's about citizen journalism. We see that in crises like the Iranian electoral crisis, where Western journalists perhaps didn't have access across the country, that we relied on Twitter. We rely on blogs. But the problem with some of this citizen journalism is it's hard, who's accountable? So I was wondering how it affects your work as correspondents, this information getting out there, and how it affects how you actually pursue stories. The second is a fluff question. If one of you want to express, is there a story that you would have loved to cover but couldn't for security reasons or whatever? Is there something that you could pinpoint? Thanks.
Martin will run down the table.
Oh, I was so interested in the idea of a fluff question, but I don't think I have an answer to that. I'm going to take a pass.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't think of an example either. But in terms of citizen journalism, I think, as Martin said earlier, what it's done, in fact, we'd like to think is what it's done is to reinforce the need for professional journalists. Because citizen journalists, absolutely, I think it was Patrick who mentioned this, that they can do very professional work and they can tell you what the news is. But I think trained journalists can go beyond that and provide context and analysis and do it the way, hopefully, that people like. But there is definitely room for citizen journalism. There's room for alternative journalism as well, because there's as many varied tastes for journalism as there are kinds out there now. So I think I welcome it. That's all.
Sorry. I'm having a lot of trouble with this. Excuse me. You can tell I'm a print journalist for good reason. The response to both parts of your question actually revolves around Iran, where I think we saw some of the strengths of citizen journalism being offered. We are at least accepting that that's a fairly representational view of people there. We'd like to think so. It certainly jives with other things we hear. But with the exception of occasions such as that, I'm very wary of citizen journalism because of the opportunity it presents to other organizations to present their viewpoint as if they're innocent civilians. Iran is also the biggest story I wish I could cover. I have never been allowed, I've never received a visa despite repeated attempts to go to Iran, and I would have loved to have been there. Instead of relying on citizen journalism to tell me what was going down on the ground there, I would like to get to Iran.
Paul, can I just, sure. I should have answered, I didn't have the fluff question ready. I forgot to answer your citizen journalism question, and let me just briefly say, the Vancouver tasering story would never have come to light or been so conclusively examined without that tape. So citizen journalism means different things to different people. It's different from Twitter. Sorry, there is Twitter and then there is video. And hopefully video that is contextual and not edited out to show only certain segments. On Iran, I wanted to just say that Twitter is fascinating, but we ought not to become obsessed with it. We heard a lot of what the Twittering elite, if I can call them that, or the Twitterati, or you call it what you want, we're saying, we're texting, we're tweeting in real time. We weren't hearing from the vast majority, or I shouldn't say the vast majority, but the significant chunk of the Iranian population that either doesn't have a mobile phone, not that many, most do, but that doesn't Twitter. So what were people saying in the mosques? What were the conservative people in the countryside saying in Gom or in Shiraz or in other parts of the country who are solidly behind Ahmadinejad, for example? We don't know. So Twitter can feed not just your computer screen, but it can feed your prejudices. It can confirm what you want because you don't have that context. Not that journalists have that mystical ability to weigh the facts, but it can skew your interpretation of whether there is going to be a Twitter revolution, which never happened a year ago, or whether it will be crushed with the jackboot as happened.
And just to add to that, I think that in Iran's case as well, it's more valuable to people who have already been there. I had the unique position that I was very lucky. I actually finally did make it after 5 years of trying to get a visa to Iran. I made it and did cover the election there last year and was there for the first couple of days of violence, and then we had to leave because they wouldn't renew our visa. But I found in discussions with colleagues that, and not because I have some mystical ability or because I'm so smart, but because I had spent those 12 or 13 days in Iran prior to all the craziness, and then could interpret, could read, and knew people who were actually twittering, knew what their backgrounds were, knew where they were coming from, which areas they were talking about, then I believe that I was better informed and better able to use that Twitter stuff to report than, say, somebody who had not been there. So.
I will say only in closing, I would not want to list a story that I wished I had done but didn't get to do, because I have been able to do in my career so many wonderful stories in so many parts of the world, and I'm really grateful for that. And I don't think my colleagues up here would put up much of a fight if I suggested that by and large they agree with that sentiment. We are lucky souls, both in the work that we get to do, and tonight in the attentive and thoughtful and patient audience dealing with a couple of technical difficulties and with one or two rambling discourses. We have been grateful for your interest and attention. It is always gratifying when we know that people take an interest in the work that we do, and we thank you for that. I want to thank personally my colleagues, friends new and old. I have not felt that my job was very difficult tonight. In fact, it was quite a luxury. I just get to listen to their stories. Thanks very much for your attention.
I'm Mark Cedra, a senior fellow here at CG, and before I thank the panel, I'd like to apologize once again for some of the audio difficulties. If you've been here before, you know that we have troubled acoustics, and I can tell you that I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. It is always a major challenge getting a good phone line, let alone a good Skype line. But I think if you heard 10% of what he said, you did well. I got about 2%. But I assume it was all brilliant, so we'll just go with that. All I have to say about the panel is wow. This is the third year we've done this. I've been to the other two. And with all due respect to last year to Graham Smith and others who were on the panel and I think did a great job, this is the best one yet. You know, Joan, Colleen, and Fred, I don't know how we're going to top this next year unless we bring the same people back, but we're going to have to try very hard. But I can say that as an academic, and I'm an academic who does do field work in some difficult places, but I still rely heavily on the journalism of these very people at this panel and people like them who put their lives on the line and get those difficult stories and get the background that we need to really understand what are very complex and difficult situations. So it's my great pleasure to just thank you. Thank you all for being here, for making your way from all over the world to Waterloo and sharing your experiences, your personal feelings about the field. So I think we have a token of thanks for your participation, which Joan Eiler, who is the president of the CIC branch here, is going to give to you. So once again, thank you very much.